Philosophy tried to answer one question. What is the principle of things? How do you explain the diversity of the world around you? At the beginning, philosophers, so the Greek philosophers, tried to explain the world through material principles. They attempted to find a material element within the world that could explain everything else. But that solution was quite weak. So the first one to introduce a metaphysical explanation for the diversity of things that we see around us was Parmenides. And Parmenides might not be the most well-known of philosophers, but he was fundamental to the way that Western philosophy and also Western culture conceives of certain problems. The idea of truth as eternal or of opinion as not even being real are things that we got from Parmenides, either directly or through his influence on Plato and Aristotle. So in this essay, we will take a visual and intuitive introduction to the ideas of Parmenides, so that by the end, you have a firm overview of his thought and how it influenced Western culture as a whole. To understand Parmenides, we have to take a step back in the context in which he was writing. Parmenides himself was born in the 6th century before Christ in Asia Minor. At this time, Greek philosophy was just emerging, right around the same area. A school of philosophy called the Milesians were starting to attempt to find the cause, the fundamental principle of reality. They called this principle the arche, that is, the principle which explained all of diversity. Every phenomena that you'd see could be boiled down to this one ground, this arche. The Greeks conceived of matter very differently from what we do. They had this idea, which you have probably heard of the 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. So they thought that these were the states of matter. What did they mean by this? They actually meant that everything was a specific state of matter. So earth was solid, water was liquid, air was gas, and fire was just another category. So in that case, wood and, for instance, bodies would be earth, and everything that flowed would be water. And so what the philosophers at this time tried to do is to find which category of matter was the one that explained all others. So you had Thales, which thought that the liquid state could explain all the rest, because in a way, liquid was a middle ground. It wasn't fully solid, it wasn't fully gas. So Thales thought that water could explain the rest. There were others like Anaximenes, who was also from the Milesian school like Thales, who thought that air could explain all of the vast diversity of matter. But this has a couple issues. We cannot fully explain everything that exists simply through configurations of matter. How would you explain society? How would you explain friendship? How would you explain so many different things just with matter? Anaximenes would have simply explained it as emergence, right? So you'd have combinations of water, which would then create things like friendship. That is not a very strong solution. So the philosophers that came after the Milesians, or the natural philosophers, tried to make it a little bit more abstract, a little bit more thorough. A philosopher called Anaximander considered that this arche, this principle, would be the unlimited, which he called the apeiron, and then by limiting the unlimited, you could explain everything else. This was a step forward. You could explain abstract concepts a bit better, but it still wasn't a full-on explanation. And so that's the context in which Parmenides tried to answer the problem of the fundamental cause of the world. Parmenides' solution was incredibly elegant because he could not answer it with the same solution as the previous philosophers. He could not find a material principle, and the other principles like the limit and the unlimited were a bit too disconnected from reality to be a clear answer. So Parmenides conceptualized his solution in a book which is called on being. This book, we only have some fragments, which were preserved by a historian of philosophy. But we still have a fragment which explains his solution very elegantly. It's the fragment 6. And in the fragment 6, he says, "It is one and the same thing to think and to be." So, what does he mean by that? Here he means that when something appears in the world, right? So whether it be friendship, as we say, or whether it's wood, whether it's a city, whether it's a stream, these things can only be, they can only appear because they are thought. So in that case, you have an observer, an individual, which thinks something, and by thinking, makes it appear. And in that case, the arche, the fundamental principle of the world, is completely different. It becomes thought, which is everything that you see. It has to be thought to actually be. If we remove thought, everything would disappear. And so in that case, what is the world? If not just a manifestation of this ability to make things come into being by thought. And so this solution was quite revolutionary. It seems to find the principle of the world in something completely different from what previous philosophers had thought. The principle did not lie in nature, it did not lie in external elements. It actually lied in the ability for thought. And that entailed many metaphysical and conceptual problems. So to understand what he meant, let's take a step back. Let's look at his book and follow the journey that he attempted to guide us upon. His book was incredibly elegant because it was that of the journey of a young man guided by a goddess along a quest for knowledge. So the young man is guided along a path and then arrives at two gates. There is one gate which is a gate of day and one gate which is the gate of night. The gate of day is the gate of being, and the gate of night is the gate of non-being. The goddess then explains what is the path of being, what is the gate of being, and that gives us clear explanations as to what Parmenides meant when he said that the fundamental principle was that of thought. He considers that being has two properties. It is eternal and it is immutable. So what is something that is of all eternity. It cannot be changed. It cannot evolve. It absolutely is. And in opposition, you have what is not, things that evolve and move. And so when you look at his conception of the world, you see that it is one which is conceptual. It is not one which is material. What it means to find the principle of the world is to find the conceptual elements, which almost like the laws of nature, the fundamental structure, which does not move and will not evolve. However, you might see tides, you might see change of seasons. The principles will be eternal and immutable, the core principle of nature. And that's where thought comes in. Because thought is able to create concepts, to create definitions, which themselves are eternal and immutable. So that might seem a little bit abstract. But let's consider something. When you talk about the city, let's say you think it, right? So in Parmenides' thought, you make it come into being. The idea of a city, it's got a clear definition, right? A city will be something which, has building, like whatever definition you might take. It has a given structure, a definition which will stand of all time. Just like mathematical objects have a definition and they will be accessible of all times, the definition itself does not change through time. And as such, things that we think when we use concepts, when we use ideas, are themselves eternal and they themselves are immutable. And you will argue Well, maybe that's not the case. Let's say I think about my parents, or I think about a friend. Well, parents can get older and friends can change. But Parmenides would argue that your concept of these people, what defines them, is something that will maintain. You will have an idea, a conception of these people that will make it come into being. So there will be an aspect which would be part of being, which will be the eternal aspect, almost like the definitional aspect. And then the part which is non-being, which is their change. And so that's how Parmenides explained the nature of the world, like the fundamental structures and in a way, principles. The arche is the eternal in the world that we think through thoughts. He also explained that there was the path of non-being. And the path of non-being was that of non-existence, the path of opinions, of things that flow, the path of shadows, of in a way, everything that was material and that evolved, So everything ranging from the experiences that we would have on a day-to-day basis, which would flow, to that which we are not able to conceptualize. He called that the doxa, which was the opinion that was a way of non-being because it was non-eternal and immutable. It was in a way below thought. So when we put these two paths together, we see that the principle is thought, which makes things eternal and immutable, and everything that is changing is outside of the principles of the world. And that was, in a way, his philosophy. Everything we can think comes into being, thought is a principle. This is a fundamental idea, because even this idea of day and night is something that we see all the way up into Christian theology. The fact that there are ideas which are eternal, which are reality, and another way, opinion, which is fleeting, that comes from Parmenides. That is an idea which Parmenides himself managed to conceptualize. Plato's idea of the cavern. It seems very, very close to this idea that Parmenides had between the way of the fleeting shadows of the doxa and the way of the true forms. Parmenides' ideas of eternity influence Plato considerably, to the extent that Plato wrote a dialogue called Parmenides, where he argued specifically with these ideas. One could even argue that Plato's whole project was to try to solve some issues in Parmenides' thought, which was to include Parmenides' theory of being with the possibility for change, which Parmenides didn't manage to fully explain. And so only these aspects, this concept and its influence on Plato, showed that Parmenides was not only an original thinker, but also somebody that had a deep influence on Western philosophy and culture.